Sometimes the people with the least money give away the most humanity. Rain hammered against the side of the city bus as Clara Bennett pressed her forehead lightly against the cold window glass and watched downtown Chicago blur into streaks of silver and red. The evening traffic crawled beneath glowing streetlights, headlights reflecting across puddles like rivers of melted gold. At just 10 years old, Clara already knew how exhaustion looked on adults. She saw it every night in her mother's eyes. Abigail Bennett spent her days cleaning hotel rooms in a luxury high-rise where guests spent more money in a weekend than she earned in a month. By the time she came home each night, her hands smelled like bleach and lavender detergent, and her shoulders sagged beneath the invisible weight of survival. Clara sat quietly near the back of the bus, clutching the small pouch of coins her mother had given her that morning. It was supposed to cover her ride home and a small dinner from the corner deli downstairs. A bowl of soup, maybe crackers if the owner was feeling generous. Outside, thunder rolled across the city skyline. Inside the bus, nobody spoke much. The heater rattled overhead, blowing uneven bursts of warm air that smelled faintly of dust and wet coats. Tired office workers stared at their phones. A teenage boy in headphones tapped his sneakers against the floor. A woman in a sharp white business suit sighed loudly every few minutes as if the entire world existed only to inconvenience her. Clara stayed invisible. Her mother always told her that invisible people survived longer. Invisible people avoided trouble. Invisible people didn't get embarrassed. The bus jerked suddenly at the next stop, and the doors hissed open into the storm. A gust of freezing rain swept inside. Then she saw her. The old woman stepped carefully onto the bus wearing a faded beige coat darkened by rainwater. Her silver hair clung damply against her cheeks. She looked fragile, almost weightless, like one hard wind could carry her away. In one trembling hand, she held an old leather purse. In the other, a folded grocery bag soaked nearly through. The driver barely looked at her. "Fare," he muttered impatiently. The woman searched her purse. Her fingers shook harder with every second. Receipts, tissues, an empty eyeglass case, but no wallet. The people nearby immediately looked away. Nobody wanted involvement. Nobody wanted delay. The woman in the white suit rolled her eyes dramatically. "Come on," she muttered under her breath. "Some of us are trying to get home." The old lady's voice came out small and embarrassed. I think someone took my wallet." The driver exhaled sharply and leaned back in his seat. "Ma'am, if you can't pay, you can't ride." Rain pounded harder outside. Clara looked through the fogged-up windows at the dark sidewalks below. The temperature had dropped fast. The old woman glanced behind her at the storm, then back at the driver. For one painful second, Clara saw something in her face she recognized instantly. Not anger, not fear. Shame. Quiet shame. The kind adults wore when life had finally exhausted them. The driver tapped the steering wheel impatiently. "Ma'am, I need you to step off the bus." Nobody moved. Nobody offered help. Clara slowly opened her hand and stared at the few damp dollar bills and coins resting in her palm. Her dinner. Her ride tomorrow morning. Everything she had left until payday. Her stomach tightened. Then she looked back at the old woman standing alone beneath the harsh fluorescent lights while strangers avoided her eyes like compassion itself had become contagious. And before Clara could stop herself, she stood up. The entire bus seemed to pause with her. Clara could feel every pair of eyes turning toward her small frame as she stepped into the narrow aisle, clutching the crumpled bills tightly in her hand. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the wet rubber floor while rainwater dripped from passengers' coats onto the metal steps near the door. The old woman looked startled, almost confused, as Clara approached the fare box. "I will pay for her," Clara said quietly. Her voice was soft, but in the sudden silence of the bus, it carried farther than she expected. The driver blinked at her through the overhead mirror. "Kid, you do not have to do that." Clara swallowed hard. She knew exactly how much money sat in her hand. $8.30. Just enough for dinner and tomorrow morning's ride to school. Her stomach already ached with hunger from skipping lunch earlier that day. But she also remembered something her mother once whispered after finding a homeless man sleeping outside their apartment building in the freezing cold. The world gets colder when people stop helping each other. Clara slowly placed the money into the machine. The bills disappeared with a mechanical whir. A few coins clattered loudly into the metal tray. The old woman stared at her as though she had forgotten how to speak. That is enough for both fares, Clara added quickly before she could lose courage. A few passengers exchanged awkward looks. The woman in the white business suit shifted uncomfortably and turned back toward the window. The teenage boy removed one side of his headphones for the first time. Even the driver's expression softened slightly beneath his exhaustion. "Thank you," the old woman whispered. Her voice trembled more than her hands. Clara nodded shyly and stepped aside. "You can sit with me." The old woman hesitated before carefully lowering herself into the empty seat beside Clara near the back of the bus. Up close, Clara noticed details others probably ignored. The woman's coat, though old, had once been expensive. The stitching along the sleeves was elegant. Her silver watch looked simple but beautifully made. There was dignity in the way she carried herself, even soaked by rain and embarrassed in front of strangers. The bus pulled back into traffic with a heavy groan. Outside, downtown lights shimmered across rain-covered streets while thunder rolled somewhere over Lake Michigan. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Clara stared ahead while the old woman carefully folded her damp grocery bag on her lap. Finally, the woman smiled faintly. "Most people pretend not to see me these days." Clara looked over. "My mom says people get busy." The old woman gave a sad little laugh. Busy is one word for it. Clara studied her for a moment. There was something lonely about her eyes. Not the loneliness of being alone for one night. The deeper kind. The kind that settled into people after years of disappointment. "Are you cold?" Clara asked. "A little." Without thinking, Clara pulled off her own knit scarf and handed it over. "Here." The woman looked stunned. "Oh no, sweetheart. I could not possibly." "It is okay," Clara insisted. "My apartment is only a few blocks away." Slowly, the old woman accepted the scarf with both hands, almost carefully, like it was something fragile and precious. She wrapped it around her neck and closed her eyes for one brief second. Clara noticed moisture gathering there again, but the woman quickly looked away toward the rain-covered windows. "What is your name?" she asked softly. "Clara Bennett." "Clara," the woman repeated gently, as if committing it to memory forever. Then she extended her trembling hand. "I am Evelyn." Before Clara could answer, the bus hit another pothole, rattling the windows hard enough to make several passengers complain under their breath. But Evelyn barely reacted. She was still looking at Clara with an expression the little girl did not understand. It was not pity. It was not gratitude either. It looked more like someone rediscovering hope after believing it was gone. The rain finally began to weaken as the bus crossed the river into the older part of the city, where brick apartment buildings crowded close together beneath flickering streetlights. Water streamed down the windows in slow silver trails while the heater continued rattling overhead like it was struggling to survive the storm itself. Clara sat quietly beside Evelyn, her small hands folded tightly in her lap now that the money was gone. Hunger gnawed softly at her stomach, but she tried not to think about it. She had learned long ago that thinking about hunger only made it louder. Across the aisle, the woman in the white business suit kept glancing toward them with an expression that looked almost uncomfortable now. Earlier, she had acted irritated by the delay. Now she avoided eye contact completely. Clara noticed things like that. Children who grew up around adults learned to read silence almost as well as words. Evelyn carefully adjusted Clara's scarf around her neck. Her fingers brushed the soft fabric slowly, almost absently, as though she had not been shown kindness in a very long time. "This is beautiful," she whispered. Clara smiled faintly. "My mom found it at a thrift store for $3. Evelyn looked down at the scarf again. Something flickered across her face then. Not sadness exactly, more like regret. The bus rolled past expensive downtown hotels glowing gold against the wet streets. Men in tailored coats hurried beneath umbrellas while luxury cars crawled through traffic outside elegant restaurants filled with laughter and candlelight. Clara barely looked at any of it anymore. That world always felt close enough to see, but impossibly far away to touch. "Do you live alone?" Clara asked carefully after several minutes. Evelyn turned toward her slowly, surprised by the question. "Most of the time." Her voice carried a tired honesty that adults rarely used around children. "Do not your family visit you?" Evelyn gave a soft laugh without humor. Families are complicated when money gets involved. Clara did not fully understand that, but she understood loneliness. Her mother worked double shifts nearly every weekend. and sometimes the apartment felt so quiet Clara would leave the television on just to hear another human voice. The bus stopped again with a heavy hiss. A few passengers stepped off into the damp night air. The teenage boy who had been wearing headphones earlier paused before leaving. He glanced awkwardly toward Evelyn, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a sealed granola bar. Without saying a word, he handed it to Clara and hurried off the bus before she could respond. Clara stared down at it, stunned. Evelyn smiled softly beside her. "You see," she murmured, "kindness spreads faster than people think." Clara carefully broke the granola bar in half and offered part of it to Evelyn. The old woman hesitated before accepting it with quiet gratitude. They ate slowly while the city lights blurred past outside the rain-streaked glass. For a few peaceful minutes, the bus no longer felt cold or crowded. It felt strangely safe. Then the driver's voice crackled overhead. "Maplewood and 8th. Last stop before South Lincoln." Clara's eyes widened slightly. That was her stop. She quickly stood and pulled her worn backpack over one shoulder. Evelyn rose carefully beside her, gripping the metal pole for balance as the bus slowed toward the curb. "This is where I get off," Clara explained. For a moment, Evelyn simply looked at her. Really looked at her. Not the way adults usually glanced at children before returning to their phones or conversations. Her gaze carried attention. "Respect. Clara Bennett," she said softly once more. "You gave away your last dollars for someone you did not even know." Clara shrugged shyly. "You looked like you needed help." The bus doors opened with a hydraulic hiss. Cold air swept inside, carrying the scent of wet pavement and distant car exhaust. Before Clara stepped off, Evelyn gently touched her arm. Her pale gray eyes shimmered beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. "One day," she said quietly, "the world will remember your kindness even if you forget it yourself." Clara smiled politely, not really understanding what she meant. Then she stepped off the bus into the chilly Chicago night, while behind her, Evelyn Montgomery watched through the fogged window until the little girl disappeared beneath the flickering streetlights. Clara's apartment building stood wedged between a laundromat with flickering neon lights and a boarded-up convenience store that smelled permanently of wet cardboard and cigarette smoke. The old brick structure leaned slightly with age, its narrow windows glowing pale yellow against the damp Chicago night. Clara hurried up the cracked front steps while cold rainwater dripped from the ends of her blonde hair onto her faded sneakers. Inside, the hallway smelled like boiled cabbage, old carpet, and radiator heat that never quite reached the corners. Somewhere upstairs, a baby cried through thin walls while a television blasted an old game show loud enough for half the building to hear. Clara climbed 3 flights of stairs carrying only her backpack and the lingering warmth of the strange evening still wrapped around her thoughts. Apartment 3B sat at the very end of the hall beside a rattling ice machine that had not worked properly in years. Before Clara even opened the door, she heard her mother coughing inside. Not the small kind of cough people ignored. The deep, exhausted kind that came from working too many hours breathing cleaning chemicals in rooms with no windows open. Clara quietly stepped into the apartment. The tiny kitchen glowed beneath a single yellow light bulb above the sink. Abigail Bennett stood at the counter in her housekeeping uniform, rubbing her temples while a dented soup pot simmered weakly on the stove. Her blonde hair was tied back loosely, strands falling around her tired face. She looked up immediately when Clara entered. Relief flooded her eyes so quickly it almost hurt to see. "Thank goodness," Abigail whispered, pulling Clara into a tight hug before she even removed her coat. "The storm kept getting worse. I was worried sick." Clara hugged her back carefully. Her mother always smelled like hotel soap and fabric softener after long shifts. "I am okay." Abigail leaned back slightly and studied her daughter's face. "You are freezing." Clara smiled faintly. "I gave my scarf away." Her mother blinked in confusion. "You what?" Clara set down her backpack and slowly explained everything. The old woman, the missing wallet, the bus driver asking her to leave in the rain, the money, the scarf. Abigail listened silently while stirring the soup with one hand. As the story continued, her expression shifted between concern and quiet heartbreak. When Clara finally finished, the apartment fell still except for the faint hiss of the radiator beside the window. Abigail looked down at the nearly empty soup pot and closed her eyes briefly. "Clara," she said softly, "that money was for your dinner." Clara shrugged. "She looked colder than me." Abigail pressed her lips together tightly. For a second, Clara thought her mother might be upset. Instead, Abigail suddenly reached forward and brushed damp hair away from Clara's forehead with trembling fingers. There were tears gathering in her eyes now. "Your grandfather used to say something like that," she whispered. "He said poor people understand pain faster because they see it every day." Clara climbed onto one of the kitchen stools while her mother ladled thin vegetable soup into two chipped bowls. Steam curled upward into the dim apartment air. Outside the window, sirens echoed somewhere downtown beneath the distant rumble of thunder. "Was the woman nice?" Abigail asked quietly. Clara nodded immediately. She was lonely. Something about the certainty in her daughter's voice made Abigail pause. Clara rarely judged people quickly. She observed them carefully, almost instinctively. "What was her name?" Clara stirred her soup slowly. "Evelyn." Abigail repeated the name absently while sitting down across from her. Neither of them noticed the black luxury sedan parked briefly across the street below. Its tinted windows reflected the rain-covered streetlights while the engine idled silently beneath the stormy sky. Inside the vehicle, a man in a dark suit sat in the front passenger seat speaking quietly into a phone. "Yes," he said carefully. "We found her." Upstairs, completely unaware, Clara ate slowly while exhaustion settled into her small shoulders. She glanced toward the empty hook beside the apartment door where her scarf normally hung. Oddly enough, she did not regret giving it away. Somewhere deep inside her, the old woman's final words still lingered like an echo she could not fully explain. "The world will remember your kindness even if you forget it yourself." Clara did not know why, but for the first time in a very long while, the cold little apartment no longer felt quite so small. The next morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. Wind swept through the streets hard enough to rattle loose signs above storefronts, while dirty snow from the previous week clung stubbornly to the edges of sidewalks. Clara woke before sunrise to the sound of pipes groaning somewhere inside the apartment walls. For a few seconds she stayed curled beneath her thin blanket listening to the city wake slowly outside her window. A distant siren. A garbage truck grinding through the alley. Someone downstairs arguing loudly over rent money. Normal sounds. Familiar sounds. But something felt different this morning, though she could not explain why. In the kitchen, Abigail stood buttoning the cuffs of her housekeeping uniform while hastily sipping burnt coffee from a chipped mug. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes. She had barely slept after taking an extra overnight shift cleaning banquet halls downtown. "Eat something before school," she reminded Clara softly while searching for her bus card inside her purse. Clara opened the cabinet and found only half a loaf of bread and peanut butter. She quietly made toast while her mother tied her hair back in the hallway mirror. The apartment still felt cold despite the rattling radiator hissing beside the couch. "I might be late tonight," Abigail said apologetically. "There is a convention at the hotel this weekend." Clara nodded. She was used to late nights. Used to reheated soup and quiet apartments and falling asleep to the sound of keys finally turning in the front door after midnight. Abigail kissed the top of her daughter's head before leaving. "And Clara?" "Yeah." Her mother smiled faintly despite her exhaustion. "I am proud of you." After the door closed, Clara stood silently in the tiny kitchen, holding her toast, while warmth spread through her chest stronger than hunger. Nobody had said those words to her in a long time. Outside, the morning air sliced sharply through her coat as she walked toward the bus stop. The city looked washed pale beneath heavy clouds. People hurried past with coffee cups and lowered heads, shoulders hunched against the wind. Clara shoved her hands into her pockets and waited beside the cracked bench near the corner pharmacy. She noticed immediately that something felt strange. Two black SUVs sat parked across the street with engines running softly. Their glossy paint reflected the cloudy sky, while men in dark coats stood nearby, speaking quietly into earpieces. Clara stared for a moment before looking away. Vehicles like those did not belong in her neighborhood. A woman walking her dog slowed down to stare openly at them. Even the owner of the corner deli stood outside smoking a cigarette while watching curiously. Then one of the SUV doors opened. Clara froze. A tall man stepped out wearing an expensive charcoal overcoat and polished black shoes that never touched puddles by accident. Everything about him looked precise, controlled, important. He scanned the street carefully before his gaze settled directly on Clara. To her surprise, The man smiled warmly and approached slowly, careful not to frighten her. "Good morning," he said politely. "Are you Clara Bennett?" Clara tightened her grip on her backpack straps. "Maybe." The man's smile widened slightly. "That is probably a smart answer." He reached into his coat pocket and carefully removed something folded in clear protective plastic. Clara's eyes widened instantly. It was her scarf, cleaned and neatly folded. "Miss Evelyn asked me to return this to you personally," he explained gently. Clara stared at the scarf in disbelief. "You know Evelyn?" The man exchanged a quick glance with someone inside the SUV before answering. "Very well." Before Clara could ask another question, the rear passenger door of the second SUV slowly opened. Conversations along the sidewalk stopped completely. Even traffic noise suddenly seemed quieter somehow. Then Evelyn Montgomery stepped out wearing an elegant cream-colored wool coat, pearl earrings, and gloves that probably cost more than Abigail earned in 2 weeks. Gone was the soaked, lonely woman from the city bus. This Evelyn carried herself like someone the world listened to when she spoke. Pedestrians nearby openly stared now. The deli owner nearly dropped his cigarette. Clara stood motionless beneath the freezing Chicago wind while realization slowly settled into her chest. The lonely old woman from the bus had not simply been wealthy. She belonged to an entirely different world. For several long seconds, Clara could only stare. The freezing wind tugged gently at her blonde hair, while the city seemed to slow around her. Cars rolled past more quietly somehow. Pedestrians lingered near storefronts pretending not to watch, while very obviously watching. The elegant woman standing before her looked nothing like the soaked, lonely passenger from the bus the night before, and yet the eyes were exactly the same. Calm, tired, deeply human. Evelyn Montgomery smiled softly as she approached the sidewalk curb. "Good morning, Clara." Her voice carried warmth that did not match the expensive convoy surrounding her. Clara looked from the black SUVs to the sharply dressed men nearby and back again. "You are rich," she blurted out before she could stop herself. One of the security men coughed awkwardly into his fist. Evelyn laughed gently, the sound surprisingly real beneath the cold Chicago air. "That is certainly one way to put it." Clara tightened her grip on her backpack straps. "Why were you on the bus?" Evelyn's expression shifted slightly then. Not embarrassed, more thoughtful. She glanced toward the cloudy skyline rising above downtown towers in the distance. "Because sometimes," she said quietly, "it is the only place where people still tell you the truth." Clara did not fully understand the answer, but before she could ask more, Evelyn stepped closer and carefully handed back the scarf. It smelled faintly of lavender now, freshly cleaned and pressed. Clara took it slowly. "You cleaned it?" "Of course." Evelyn's eyes softened. "It mattered to you." Across the street, more people had started gathering outside nearby businesses pretending to check their phones while openly staring at the luxury vehicles. Clara could hear whispers drifting through the freezing wind now. "Who is that?" "That looks like Evelyn Montgomery." "The Evelyn Montgomery?" Clara frowned slightly. The name sounded familiar somehow. Then suddenly she remembered. A few months earlier, her social studies teacher had assigned a report about major American business leaders. Evelyn Montgomery had owned hotels, hospitals, and technology companies across the country. News anchors called her one of the wealthiest women in America. Clara slowly looked back at the woman standing in front of her and felt her stomach flip. "You are that Evelyn Montgomery?" she whispered. Evelyn sighed softly, almost sadly. "Unfortunately, yes." Clara blinked in disbelief. "But why did you not tell me?" The billionaire looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Would you have treated me the same way if I had?" The question settled quietly between them while icy wind rattled the nearby bus stop sign. Clara thought honestly about it. About the soaked coat, the trembling hands, the lonely eyes. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said. "I think I would have." Something inside Evelyn's face softened completely then, as though a wall she had carried for years had suddenly cracked open. One of the men near the SUV stepped forward holding a leather folder. "Ma'am, your meeting downtown begins in 40 minutes. Evelyn barely acknowledged him. Her attention never left Clara. "Do you know what happened after you got off the bus last night?" Clara shook her head. Evelyn folded her gloved hands carefully. "The young man who gave you the granola bar? He later told another passenger why he did it." Clara listened quietly. "Then the woman in the white suit bought dinner for a homeless veteran outside Union Station." Evelyn smiled faintly. The bus driver paid for 3 riders after his shift ended. Clara's eyes widened. Really? Really? Evelyn looked toward the busy street beyond them. You changed something on that bus, Clara? Most people think kindness disappears. But it does not. It moves. The city noise around them suddenly felt far away. Clara looked down at the scarf in her hands, then back at Evelyn. For the first time in her young life, someone powerful was speaking to her as though her actions mattered. Not because she was rich, not because she was important, but because she had been kind when nobody else was. A cold gust swept through the street again, but Clara barely noticed anymore. Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and slowly removed a small cream-colored card embossed with gold lettering. I would like to meet your mother, she said gently. If that would be all right with you. Clara stared at the cream-colored card resting in Evelyn's gloved hand as if it might disappear. Gold lettering shimmered softly against the thick paper beneath the cloudy Chicago sky. Even without reading it, she could tell it belonged to a world completely different from hers. You want to meet my mom? She asked quietly. Evelyn nodded. Very much. One of the security men stepped closer again, clearly nervous about the growing crowd nearby. Several people openly stood filming with their phones now. A delivery driver had stopped unloading boxes entirely just to stare at the line of black SUVs parked outside the apartment block. But Evelyn seemed unaffected by any of it. Wealth had made her immune to attention years ago. Instead, her focus remained entirely on the small blonde girl standing in front of her with a worn backpack and secondhand shoes. Your mother raised someone extraordinary, Evelyn said softly. Clara immediately shook her head. I am not extraordinary. Evelyn's smile deepened slightly. That is usually how truly extraordinary people speak. The words made Clara's cheeks warm despite the freezing wind. She looked down awkwardly at the scarf folded in her hands. Nobody had ever described her that way before. Not teachers rushing through crowded classrooms. Not neighbors exhausted by unpaid bills and long shifts. Certainly not the wealthy guests at the hotel where Abigail worked who often passed through life without noticing the people cleaning behind them. A city bus hissed to a stop nearby, but Clara barely noticed. Her entire morning had started to feel dreamlike somehow. Can I ask you something? Clara said carefully. Anything. Were you testing people? Evelyn's expression changed instantly. The softness faded into something older, sadder. She glanced toward the skyline again, where steel towers disappeared into low gray clouds. No, she answered quietly. I was trying to remember whether kindness still existed when there was nothing to gain from it. Clara frowned slightly. Evelyn exhaled slowly before continuing. When people know who I am, they behave differently. They laugh louder, smile wider, offer help before I ask for it. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the gathering crowd nearby. But yesterday on that bus, nobody saw Evelyn Montgomery. They only saw an old woman who could not pay her fare. The truth in her voice settled heavily into the cold morning air. Clara suddenly understood something adults often missed. Money could protect people from many things. Hunger, cold, fear, but maybe not loneliness. Evelyn looked back at her. And then you stood up. Clara swallowed quietly. My mom would have helped you too. Something inside Evelyn seemed to break open at those words. She looked away for a moment, blinking carefully as though fighting emotion she rarely allowed herself to show in public. The man holding the leather folder glanced down respectfully, pretending not to notice. Finally, Evelyn smiled again, though this time it looked fragile. Then I would very much like to thank your mother personally. Before Clara could answer, a familiar voice suddenly called from across the street. Clara. Abigail Bennett hurried toward them through the crosswalk, still wearing her housekeeping uniform beneath a thin winter coat. Her face was pale with panic. One of the neighbors must have called her after seeing the motorcade outside the apartment building. Abigail's eyes darted immediately between the SUVs, the security team, and her daughter standing beside one of the richest women in America. Fear flooded her expression instantly. Clara, are you all right? She asked breathlessly, reaching her daughter within seconds. Clara nodded quickly. Mom, it is okay. Abigail turned toward Evelyn uncertainly, clearly trying to process what she was seeing. She looked painfully out of place beside the polished vehicles and expensive coats around them. Her hands still carried faint traces of cleaning chemicals beneath the cold morning light. I am sorry, Abigail said nervously. Has there been some kind of misunderstanding? Evelyn stepped forward before anyone else could speak. Then, to the absolute shock of everyone watching, the billionaire extended both hands warmly toward the exhausted hotel housekeeper. "No misunderstanding at all," Evelyn said gently. "Mrs. Bennet, your daughter helped me when nobody else would. And I believe that says something beautiful about the woman who raised her." Abigail froze completely. Around them, cameras lowered. Conversation stopped. Even the wind seemed quieter somehow, while the richest woman on the sidewalk looked at a tired single mother not with superiority, not with pity, but with genuine respect. Abigail Bennet stood frozen beneath the gray Chicago sky, while strangers along the sidewalk openly stared. She looked down at the elegant hands holding hers, then back at the woman standing before her in disbelief. Evelyn Montgomery was a face people recognized from magazine covers, charity galas, and financial news broadcasts playing silently in electronic stores. Abigail had cleaned hotel suites where guests talked about Evelyn Montgomery like she was untouchable, almost mythical. And now that same woman stood outside a worn apartment building holding the hands of a tired housekeeper as though nothing else in the world mattered. "I do not understand," Abigail whispered honestly. Evelyn's eyes softened. "Yesterday your daughter saw an old woman everyone else ignored." Her voice carried calm dignity beneath the freezing wind. "She gave away her own dinner money so I would not stand in the rain alone." Abigail slowly looked toward Clara, whose cheeks turned pink with embarrassment. "Clara," she murmured quietly. Evelyn smiled gently at the little girl. "You raised her to notice people. That is rarer than you think." Around them, the neighborhood had practically stopped moving. Apartment windows filled with curious faces peeking through blinds. The deli owner remained outside pretending to sweep while listening to every word. A city bus slowed noticeably as it passed the street corner, passengers pressing against windows to glimpse the scene unfolding beside the black SUVs. But Evelyn seemed entirely unconcerned by the attention. For the first time in a very long while, she looked more interested in humanity than image. "Would you both have breakfast with me?" she asked softly. Abigail nearly pulled her hands back in panic. "Oh no, ma'am. I have worked downtown in less than an hour, and I am not really dressed for," Evelyn interrupted gently. "Neither was I yesterday." The words landed with such quiet grace that Abigail suddenly fell silent. Clara glanced between the two women while cold wind curled through the street. For years, she had watched wealthy people walk past her mother without ever truly seeing her. Yet here stood one of the richest women in America speaking to Abigail with more kindness than most people ever had. Evelyn turned toward the waiting SUV and nodded once. Immediately, one of the men opened the rear passenger door. The interior glowed with warm amber lighting and soft cream leather. Clara hesitated. She had never even touched a car that expensive before. "You are safe," Evelyn said softly, noticing her uncertainty. "I promise." Slowly, Abigail and Clara climbed inside. The door closed with a quiet, solid hush that shut out the noise of the city entirely. Warm air wrapped around them instantly. Clara sank carefully into the leather seat, afraid she might accidentally damage something just by touching it. Across from them, Evelyn removed her gloves slowly, and for the first time Clara noticed how tired she truly looked beneath the elegance and wealth. Not physically tired, soul tired. The SUV pulled smoothly into traffic while downtown skyscrapers rose ahead through the pale morning haze. "Can I tell you something I have never said publicly?" Evelyn asked quietly after several moments. Abigail exchanged a nervous glance with Clara before nodding politely. Evelyn stared out the tinted window while Chicago moved around them in muted silver and gray. 6 months ago," she said softly, "my doctors told me my heart condition was getting worse." Clara's eyes widened slightly. "Are you sick?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "Not today." Then her expression dimmed again. "But illness has a way of making people honest with themselves." Her gloved fingers rested quietly in her lap now. "I spent decades building companies, hotels, charities, foundations. Everyone called me successful." She looked down for a moment. "And yet somewhere along the way, I realized I could walk into a room filled with 100 people and still feel completely alone." The honesty in her voice filled the SUV with silence. Even the driver seemed careful not to interrupt. "Yesterday I left a hospital appointment and decided not to use my car service. I wanted to sit among ordinary people again, to remember what real life felt like." Evelyn looked directly at Clara then. Most people avoided me the second they thought I had nothing left to offer them. Her eyes shimmered softly beneath the morning light filtering through the windows. Except your daughter. Abigail's face tightened with emotion. Clara quietly reached across the seat and took her mother's hand. Outside, towering glass buildings reflected the cloudy sky like mirrors of another world entirely. But inside the warm SUV, something far more important had begun to grow between three people from completely different lives. Not pity, not charity, something rarer. Recognition. The restaurant overlooked the Chicago River from the top floor of a gleaming downtown tower wrapped in glass and steel. Below, the city moved like rivers of light beneath the cloudy winter sky, while ferries cut slowly through dark water between bridges and skyscrapers. Clara had never been anywhere so beautiful in her life. The dining room glowed with soft golden light reflected across polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers that hung overhead like frozen waterfalls. Waiters moved quietly between tables carrying silver trays, while low piano music drifted through the air like something from an old movie. Clara sat stiffly beside her mother at a table near the windows, afraid even her breathing might somehow be too loud for a place like this. Abigail looked equally overwhelmed. She kept smoothing invisible wrinkles from her housekeeping uniform beneath the borrowed wool coat one of Evelyn's assistants had kindly brought for her. But Evelyn treated neither of them like outsiders. She spoke to Clara about school, asked Abigail about her favorite books, thanked the waiter by name each time he refilled their glasses. Slowly, the tension around the table began to soften. Warmth replaced fear. And for the first time in years, Abigail Bennett laughed without exhaustion hiding underneath it. Halfway through breakfast, Evelyn quietly slid a folder across the table. Abigail immediately looked nervous again. "Ma'am, we cannot accept charity." Evelyn smiled gently. "Good, because this is not charity." Abigail hesitated before opening the folder. Her eyes widened almost instantly. Inside were documents. School enrollment forms, medical coverage information, housing paperwork. Clara leaned closer, confused. "What is all this?" Evelyn folded her hands calmly. "Your apartment building was recently placed for sale. The new owners plan to raise rents next month." Abigail's face went pale. "How did you know that?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "I own the company buying the property." Silence settled across the table. Clara stared at her mother whose hands had already begun trembling slightly. "I have no interest in forcing good people out of their homes," Evelyn continued softly. "So the building will remain affordable housing permanently." Abigail blinked rapidly as if struggling to process the words. Evelyn gently tapped the folder. "There is also a scholarship trust for Clara through college if she chooses." Clara's eyes widened. "College?" Evelyn nodded. "The world needs people who notice others." Abigail suddenly covered her mouth with one hand as tears filled her eyes completely now. Years of exhaustion, fear, bills, anxiety. All of it seemed to crack open at once beneath the soft restaurant lighting. "Why would you do this for us?" she whispered shakily. Evelyn looked out the towering windows toward the city below before answering. "Because yesterday your daughter reminded me of the person I used to be before money became louder than humanity." Her voice carried no performance now, only truth. Clara looked down quietly at the folded scarf resting beside her plate. The same scarf she almost had not given away because she had been afraid of being cold. Funny how one small decision could change everything. Weeks passed after that morning, and the story spread farther than anyone expected. Not because Evelyn Montgomery announced it publicly. She never did. But the bus driver told his wife. The woman in the white suit told coworkers. The teenage boy told friends at school. Somehow the story kept moving through the city like ripples across water. Soon donations appeared anonymously at homeless shelters near Union Station. A free meal program expanded downtown after local restaurant owners volunteered support. Even the city bus company quietly launched a hardship fare fund for riders in emergency situations. And through it all, Clara Bennett remained exactly the same little girl who had stood up on a rainy bus simply because another human being looked alone. Months later, spring sunlight poured through the windows of a small new apartment overlooking a neighborhood park filled with blooming trees and children laughing beneath blue skies. Clara sat at her desk finishing homework while Abigail cooked dinner in a kitchen large enough for both of them to stand comfortably side by side. On Clara's bookshelf rested framed scholarship certificates and school awards she still barely believed belonged to her. But beside all of them, tucked carefully inside a tiny glass box, sat an old bus ticket and a folded scarf. Simple reminders that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness travel farther than wealth ever could. And somewhere in Chicago, whenever Evelyn Montgomery rode through the city in black SUVs beneath towers bearing her name, she no longer looked only at buildings and profits. She looked for people. Because one cold rainy night, a little girl with almost nothing had reminded one of the richest women in America that dignity is not measured by status, and humanity does not belong to the powerful alone.